pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion titled The Sharing Decisions in the Context of Suffering and Dying. Today's conversation will place a strong emphasis on the concept of personhood and the relational dynamics that exist between patients, their families, and healthcare professionals. Each speaker will have approximately 10 minutes to present their insights, and we will conclude with an open Q&A where I encourage every one of you to join the discussion. Before introducing our speakers, I would like to briefly share the journey that brought us here together for this discussion. Last summer, at the Institute of Medical Ethics conference in London, I had the great pleasure to meet both Paquita and Cesar. A few weeks later, I was invited to propose a panel on end-of-life care for this conference. And this seemed like the perfect occasion to further develop the dialogue with Paquita and Cesar, who very kindly agreed to be part of this panel and this journey. At the same time, the desire to expand this conversation brought together a number of medical doctors and nurses, some I already knew and some I met along the way, with a shared interest in this topic. Among them was Jill, whom I had the pleasure of getting to know. With this group, we began meeting monthly, sharing our own questions, experiences, and sometimes discoveries about shared decision-making and end-of-life care. More often than not, as the only not real doctor in the group, I found myself asking questions in response to their questions, seeking to better understand their lived experiences with their patients and medical implications. Some of those questions were like, how can us as a healthcare professional make people understanding their conditions without being paternalistic? What's the relationship between healthcare professional being involved in the patient care, but at the same time maintaining their objectivity? What does it mean to accompany patients in their suffering? So I'm truly grateful to present this panel today, which in many ways is both the result of relationships formed around shared interest and hopefully the beginning of a work together on topics dear to us as bioethicists and or healthcare professionals, but can also touch upon everyone else's lived experience. So the first speaker will be Gillian Hayes. Jill is a clinical nurse specialist in palliative care working for St. Joseph's Hospice in East London. Jill's experience volunteering in a hospice in Eswatini and working in care homes, acute care, homeless health, and general practice has driven her toward a more holistic approach to patient care. And in the last 7 years, she has become increasingly interested in the specialist field of palliative and end-of-life care, stemming both from personal and professional experiences. The second speaker will be Dr. Paquita de Zulueta. Paquita is a retired GP and also an honorary senior clinical lecturer at Imperial College. Since 2008, Paquita has been working as a part-time cognitive behavioral therapist. For 10 years, she was a member of Imperial College NHS Trust Clinical Ethics Committee and for 6 of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. She's also a trustee of the Institute of Medical Ethics and a member of the Royal College of GPs Ethics Committee. And Paquita has also set up a charity called Human Values in the Healthcare Forum, which aims to humanize healthcare through the core values of compassion, integrity, inclusiveness, justice, and wisdom. And last but not least, Dr. Cesar Atuire. Cesar is a philosopher and healthcare ethicist who is currently the ethics lead for the Master of Science in International Health and Tropic Medicine at the University of Oxford. He is also an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Ghana and an affiliate instructor at the University of Washington's Department of Bioethics and Humanities. Cesar is the president of the International Association of Bioethics till 2026, and his recent publications include What is a Person? Untapped Insights from Africa, co-authored with Nancy Jacker. Now that my job is done, I'll hand over to Jill.
Thanks, Ilaria, and good afternoon to you all. Oscar Wilde writes in his letters from Reading Jail, "Suffering is really a revelation. One discerns things one never discerned before." Is this true for us? Today, in this short time, I want to discuss 3 considerations. Firstly, the importance and understanding of addressing suffering as more than just physical pain, and how this understanding shapes my experience, the patient or person in front of me, and the family and friends around them. Secondly, can hope and light exist and shine through the darkness of suffering? And lastly, the power of understanding the I of the person, who they really are, in order to create trust and help them face the truth of their reality. So to turn first to the topic of suffering. Human suffering is, of course, much wider than physical illness or physical pain. In St. John Paul II's apostolic letter on the salvific meaning of suffering, physical suffering is differentiated from moral suffering, i.e. the pain of the soul. I noticed from working in healthcare that we have lots of resources in place to address physical suffering, but limited resources such as lack of confidence, skill, or time readily available to address moral suffering. Cicely Saunders, whose exhibition features at this convergence, revolutionized how we see suffering by developing the concept of total pain, which seeks to understand not just the physical, but also the social, emotional, spiritual, and mental pain that a person experiences, not ignoring or devaluing any aspect of it as less important. For me, I also hold tight to this concept that suffering is an absence, a distortion, a privation of a good. So, for example, physical illness being an absence of a healthy part. I hold on to that hypothesis. Why? Because through personal experiences, journeying with a family member with aggressive head and neck cancer, the death of my father, through meeting Cicely Saunders, not personally, but I see the possibility of a good to be had in illness, in suffering, and in death itself. At times, I may only see a fraction of that goodness, but I understand that it's reasonable to have a positive hypothesis about suffering and illness and death. I carry that hypothesis with me in my work. Certainly, in this fast evolving world where we have developed the ability to cure certain illnesses and been benefited from technological advancements to help solve everyday problems, suffering can also be seen as a problem to be solved, like we see unfold in the assisted suicide bill. Whilst medicine has come a long way to help manage the physical aspects of suffering, again, we can partly credit Cicely's contribution to pain control. These medical and technological advances don't quite touch other aspects of suffering. The social, emotional, spiritual, mental pain of realizing your life is limited and perhaps coming to an end. So what now? Who do we turn to? What helps then? Can we solve this problem alone? Is it necessary to have others journey with us? On a recent home visit, a patient shared with me, "I want to end my life now. What's the process and how can I do this?" His question made my heart pound in my chest like a drum, because this intelligent, well-informed man could not see a reason to live at this moment. And I starkly remember thinking that if assisted suicide was legal in this country, this man could have been lost to that path before ever realizing why he felt that way. What was at the origin? What was the truth of his being, even when his physical body is failing? In addition, and upon reflection, it's also a question many physically healthy people ask themselves, not just those with terminal illness. I can't go on living. I can't continue on this job. I want to quit now. I awoke from my sense of routine and what I needed to do, to asking and pleading the Lord, what can I do here? Please, Holy Spirit, guide me what to say. This is beyond me. I'd be missing a step if I failed to share this with you. Swiftly, I needed to return to the reality that there was a man, a family, and myself here in this room in front of this question, a question that I could not silence. I could not offer a quick way out, and one that I couldn't offer a theoretical response. It's in these kinds of moments truth and vulnerability really show up. We are forced to listen with our hearts and souls, not just our heads, to find the true way to care, the true way to be with the person. If it's anything less, you see it in your patient's response, you feel it in yourself. We started to unpick what was at the origin of his question of his wish to die. He highlighted about his sense of being a burden on his family, his deep sense that he no longer had a purpose as his body increasingly became more disabled, his sense of deep sadness and loneliness that no one really understands what he's going through, and his grief for the loss of his functioning. We tried to explore each of these areas, trying to look at, for instance, his sense of burden, beginning a conversation with his family with this, practical measures like would additional care or support offload the pressure. We tried to look at his sense of purpose, try to understand a bit of the story of his life, what his job was, his travels, his family, his pleasures in life, what had helped him through at other difficult points in his life. We looked at who he is if he can no longer physically function, what that could mean. Is it possible to still have meaning in life? What about his soul, his spirit? In fact, this was the area that gave him a little glimpse of light. He felt that speaking to God, to praying to a higher being at this stage in his life is what he yearned for. I had spoken about counselling, about the GP reviewing his mood biochemically, considering medications. But for him, where there was the slightest glimmer of light was connecting to a higher being. I said to him, where you sense that little glimmer of light, this is where we need to run to and focus our attention for now. So we began trying to explore with his family and his local church community if they could do a home visit to meet him, to accompany his need to pray and connect. At the end of this encounter, there wasn't a resurrection of this man, but a slight, it felt to me, meaningful transition in his outlook. Whilst I understood that I didn't have the answers to give him or a quick fix solution, I did feel a real shift in his energy from this connection, from sharing and taking time to hear him, and in me being open to consider these other aspects of suffering. I observed where there was some lights coming from and tried to focus our attention there, both in practical matters, but also aspects of the heart. What I also understood is that I didn't have the answers to give him or a quick fix solution. I was inadequate in front of his question and his ultimate destiny. In my inadequacy and without a clear answer, I could only offer him at that moment, can I come and see you again next week and continue the conversation? In this gentleman, I saw amongst the pain some glimmers of beauty and positivity, which at this moment was addressing the spiritual aspects of his being. I've seen this glimmer of light in different ways with other patients who are facing a terminal illness, whether it begin through connecting to music, their dog, the birth of their grandchild, or the love of a spouse. What I'm understanding is that where there are little glimmers of light, this is where we need to focus our attention and run with it, go deeper, follow it, help that person to face the truth of their current reality, as messy as that may be. In considering further the topic of hope and light existing brightly amongst the darkness of suffering, it draws me on to speaking about another gentleman I encountered who really shaped and inspired me every time I visited him. I'd been seeing this young man and his wife for many months. He had a brain tumour that was progressively affecting physically every part of him, his mobility, his ability to wash and dress, his eating and drinking, and eventually his sight and his hearing. At every change in functioning, there was a period of adjustment for him and his wife, a sense of initial loss and change. But each time, they both adapted to their routine and began again to live with this new way of being. The house was often filled with friends and family who also helped with these changes, practically, physically, and in the form of company. Towards the end of his earthly life, he went blind. If he knew his wife was in the room, then he felt safe. As long as she was there, he would say that it's okay, and he could trust what was happening or who else might be in the room. Most times when I visited this gentleman, he would share with me how much he loved his wife and wanted to keep living for her. She too appeared to give everything to him. We had a moment whereby he needed to go to hospital, and a question about whether he should come to the hospice or return back to his home was raised. He had expressed a wish to die at home if it was possible to manage his symptoms, but often he would say to me, where my wife is, then that's fine wherever I go. I was having concerns about him returning home as things were becoming more difficult to care for him. But I also needed to stay with the wife's needs in her heart and for her to live without regret, but also consider how much she could cope as a caregiver. We spoke at length of what could be offered at home and in the hospice. Every time I met this couple, I was truly emotionally affected by what I saw and heard, and was struck by the power of love and connectivity that he had with his wife and his family, and how they managed to find a way through the darkness. I felt I could no longer just go back to my everyday routine, but felt empowered and more alive from observing the power of love. He wanted to live because of love of her, and she wanted to do everything to journey with him because of love of him, despite the huge emotional, physical, mental toil that could be seen. This showed me what love enables you to do. The journey that you can walk when you are in love is extraordinary. It questioned a lot in me about whether I live from a love like this. I wanted to love and be loved the way that they loved. The last reflection I want to talk about is a lady who taught me the value of understanding who the person is before me and beyond their illness. She was a lady with lung disease, given a prognosis of 1 year to live and dependent on oxygen 24 hours a day to breathe. My encounter with her involved listening to her questions: what death will look like, will I die gasping for breath, how will I know when the end is near, what will happen to my family? I would often get these same questions over and over again every time I visited her. What I understand, though, through meeting her is that in front of such a prognosis, we don't suddenly become someone different. We bring our life luggage up into that point. If anxiety and fear and overthinking has been part of your story so far, then in front of a terminal prognosis, these ways of responding to reality do not suddenly change. Therefore, one of the key needs that I'm learning is to try to get to know the person, to know how they communicate, to know a bit of their life story, to know their medical history, to know a bit about their humour, how they relate, to begin a dialogue where they also are getting to know you too. I was all too aware that a generic pre-prepared textbook speech in response to her questions would not be enough. I would totally reduce the person in front of me. Firstly, I needed to know her, to understand who she is and get on her level, meet her needs, not my need to tell her everything and know that I've ticked all the right palliative care boxes. Sometimes we end up watching the shopping channel live together on TV as she gets fed up of people asking her how she is all the time. And I realised that this sharing of just being with her is also precious too. Last week, she acknowledged, even though you are very different to me, I trust you. I want you to be with me in this journey. I was touched by this and realised that trust can sometimes be beyond the uniform, beyond being seen to say the right things or medically, but it's an approach to being with a person, to making them feel heard, even if no words are used, a presence. This, of course, stems from education that I'm receiving, from receiving this gaze from others in my own life. She tells me that often I don't know exactly what I need, but I know when I come across what is true, what I need to live right now, the rest doesn't matter anymore. Like Cicely Saunders mentions, we have to feel what it's like to be so ill, to be leaving life and its activities, that you are parting from love and responsibilities. We have to learn how to feel with patients without feeling like them if we are to give the kind of listening and steady support that they need to find their own way through. For now, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we need almost a pause to reflect on those very moving cases. Thank you, Jill. So my turn now. Just to say that the title about decision-making or sharing decisions sounds more something for a boardroom. And yet, really what we're talking about is a situation where you're with a vulnerable person who's dependent on others and who's facing the unknown. None of us know what happens after we die, really. But it's something we all have to face. And so they may be anxious or frightened, they may be regretful, they may be angry, or they may actually be relieved or serene. And as somebody who's taught and written about medical ethics for many years, I could give you a kind of lecture on the doctrine of double effect, which actually is a Catholic doctrine, on how the intention is to do good, but the consequence, the side effect, if you like, might be that you hasten death, but your intention is to relieve suffering. And actually, that has been a very useful concept for doctors, I think. And then I could talk about ordinary and extraordinary means, informed consent, and so on. But actually, I'm going to focus more on being, as a doctor and a GP in particular, how I endeavored to make the kind of conversations which would help to make for a good death, or rather a good life to the very end, which very much Jill exemplified. That during that dying, that person feels supported and respected for who they are, that they can retain their sense of dignity and personhood, and that they receive the greatest comfort possible in all the dimensions, physical, psychological, and spiritual, and that we've addressed as best what matters most to them. And that they still experience some meaning and purpose, some joy, some connection, love and care in those last days? And how can I and others help them to go gentle into that good night, to quote Dylan Thomas? And as a doctor, I witnessed many deaths and accompanied many patients in their final journey. I felt actually I was more a companion, really, rather than an expert, and always had a sense of great humility and shared humanity. And I saw good deaths, if you like, where people were at home or in a hospice, surrounded by their loved ones, and feeling cared and held to the end. I also saw bad deaths, particularly when somebody panicked and a person would be rushed into hospital from a care home or from their home, and then they would die in the hospital, was surrounded by strangers and with machines, etc., you know, a very impersonal environment. And the other thing I just want to talk about is the problem with modern medicine and how we've created these situations that didn't happen so much before, because people were used to seeing dying at home. There were rituals and mourning practices, and there was also the sense of the sacred, which I think is quite often has been lost. So I'm just going to read an example from a person called Archie Cochrane, who you might know. Cochrane was one of the fathers of evidence-based medicine. But for some time, he was a prisoner of war in the Second World War in a German prisoner of war camp. And there he was acting as a doctor. And he wrote about this in his memoir called One Man's Medicine, which was published after his death in 1989. The Germans dumped a young Soviet prisoner in my ward late one night. The ward was full, so I put him in my room as he was moribund and screaming, as I didn't want to wake the rest of the ward. I examined him. He had obvious gross bilateral cavitation and a severe pleural rub, so his lungs were damaged, very damaged, and he had pleurisy. I thought the latter was the cause of the pain and the screaming. I had no morphia, just aspirin, which had no effect. I felt desperate. I knew very little Russian then, and there was no one in the ward who did. I finally, instinctively, sat down on the bed and took him in my arms, and the screaming stopped almost at once. He died peacefully in my arms a few hours later. It wasn't the pleurisy that caused the screaming, but loneliness. It was a wonderful education about the care of the dying. I was ashamed of my misdiagnosis and kept the story secret. And I think there's a lot in that story, that it isn't always about medication, painkillers, lethal cocktails. It's about human touch, kindness, and companionship, which is very much the theme of this conference. So just, I don't want to take too much time, but just to think about autonomy and individual autonomy, which is so much the Western concept, and yet in this situation, the end of life, it really isn't very appropriate, and there's much more an understanding of relational autonomy, that we are actually embedded as social creatures in our relationships. That's what gives us meaning and strength in those times. And Epstein and Street have written a lovely article called Shared Mind. The full title is Communication, Decision-Making, and Autonomy in Serious Illness. And they talk about shared mind being a collaborative cognition, the thinking together, and attunement, which again is something which is absolutely neurobiologically, if you like, in us, that when we emerge from the womb, our first contact with our mother or another caregiver, and we connect with each other. We have mirror neurons, and we have ways that is very profound and is part of our attachment system. So there's that attunement, but attunement can happen between adults, it can happen between doctors and patients, and that's really resonating with what they're experiencing and having that real sense of connection. And then the final thing they talk about is sense making, that together you kind of brainstorm and you work out what are the values, what are the preferences, and together you create something that you may not have had right at the beginning. And that's the other thing, decision making is dynamic, it's iterative, as we heard, it changes. People at that end of life change their minds about things, and they should have the right and the ability to do so, and be enabled to do so. So just another person that I admire greatly is Atul Gawande, who talks a book called Being Mortal, Illness, Medicine, and What Matters in the End. And he talks about modern medicine. He's very critical, perhaps even more than I would be. The problem with medicine and the institutions it has spawned for the care of the sick and the old is not that they've had an incorrect view of what makes life significant. The problem is that they've had almost no view at all. Medicine focus is narrow. Medical professionals concentrate on repair of health, not sustenance of the soul. I hope some do, but anyway. Yet, and this is the painful paradox, we've decided that they should be the ones who largely define how we live in our waning days. For more than half a century now, we have treated the trials of sickness, aging, and mortality as medical concerns. It's been an experiment in social engineering, putting our fates in the hands of people valued more for their technical prowess than for their understanding of human needs. The experiment has failed. If safety and protection were all we sought in life, perhaps we would conclude differently. But because we seek a life of worth and purpose, and yet are routinely denied the conditions that make it possible, there's no other way to see what modern society has done. So that's a kind of critical view, but I do believe that there's a lot in that. There's too much seeing humans as machines to be fixed rather than living beings with souls. And just very finally, another person I admire is Harvey Max Chochinov, who's written a lovely book called Dignity in Care, The Human Side of Medicine. And he talks about the ABCD of dignity in care, and even devised a questionnaire for what is it that people want to be seen, how they want to be treated, what matters to them. And the A is on the attitude, it's seeing people in their wholeness, it's being self-aware, mindful, humility and openness. And he has the platinum rule, not the golden rule, because actually the golden rule, people may feel differently about things. So he says, do unto patients as they would have done to themselves. And B, he talks about those behavioral things which can be very important, like sitting down when you're with somebody who's ill or dying, rather than standing looming over you. And I'm sure you've all experienced that if you've been in a hospital. And trying to really be present and prevent that shame and embarrassment that people may feel. And C is compassion, noticing and responding to suffering, resonating with it with empathy, but being able to have that distance and that capacity to feel, to contain the emotions, to tolerate the distress, and have that imagination to really imagine what it's like for that person. And then finally, D is dialogue, which I've talked about. So I think that I don't want to take too much time, but I can finally end with another wonderful doctor who was in 1927 called Francis Peabody. The good physician knows his patients through and through, and his knowledge is bought dearly. Time, sympathy, and understanding must be lavishly dispensed, but the reward is to be found in that personal bond which forms the greatest satisfaction of the practice of medicine. And one of the essential qualities of the clinician is interest in humanity. For the secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. So, thank you. Finished.
Great. After these two very beautiful and touching presentations, I don't know what to say. I think I'm going to try and move away from being an ethicist or a philosopher and just try to speak like a simple human being. I'll start maybe from a personal spot. By the age of 30, I was an orphan. People die young where I come from. So among my friends, we say death is a familiar and an unwelcome visitor. You can't live in our context from 0 to 20 years without witnessing a death and a birth. And I think those things allow you to be able to, to have a framework within which you face some of these existential issues. And at the same time, being an African from a Bulsa tribe is one thing. Being educated also in all the elite institutions in the West, you walk in contradiction in yourself. And sometimes there is a battle, and I call it a battle between logos and mythos that is going on within one's own body, where you're faced with these issues. You have your training, which tells you this is how you should think about life, this is how you should think about health. And also you have a sort of feeling and culture and ways of living that do not find answers in what you're being taught. So now, to take a philosophical step, I think there are 3 levels on which maybe our thinking around these issues is a bit erroneous, if not limited, and therefore require us revisiting. The first is just the concept of life. And as Paquita was saying, we have tended to think more about life in terms of biology. And therefore, when we are seeking to promote life, we're simply seeking in a way to prolong the biological function of a being. But when it comes to humans, I think life is a little bit more than just thinking about biology. It's actually not a little bit, it's much more than just thinking about biology. There is a Nigerian philosopher, Ifeanyi Menkiti, who talks about death and a second death. Technically we don't want to get into this, but even the debates around the criterion of death show us that we don't even biologically get it. We still have debates around it, right? But we're not going to go there. And there are some hiatus in our way of thinking morally and our way of thinking biologically when it comes to declaring when a person is dead. But anyway, Menkiti would say, death can occur when, the biological functions cease. But death, the second death occurs when no living person has a memory of you. Right. So death is also a transition. I'm sure the Catholics among us have beautiful things when they say, is it vita tuis et infidelibus, vita non tolitus sed mutatur. I think that's what they say, right? Right. So it's not taken, but it is muted into something. But so if we keep thinking that medicine, the function of medicine is the prolongation of biological life, then we get to this situation whereby today in many high-income countries, we are prolonging people's lives, yet we don't know how to accompany them. So yes, you live till you are 90 years, or even beyond, or even to 100, but our society, on the other hand, is organized towards so much functionality that there is a difficulty, objective difficulty, because your understanding of yourself impoverishes when you are no longer functioning, because society is pushing you towards function. Yet, biologically, the society can also maintain you breathing for a long period. And that creates an existential crisis. And so while we're thinking about, intervening to prolong life, we should be thinking about intervening to prolong livelihood. And medicine is so focused quite often on life that livelihood can sometimes fly out of the window. And we did see that with some of even the COVID policies, the COVID-19 policies. So this then leads me to a second reflection about health. Now, once again, I'll go to, some of the philosophers that I've been studying. After being grounded in all the Western philosophy, I had to go back to Africa to relearn a different type of philosophy to complement it. And there is this Nigerian author, Segun Badejisin, who talks about the concept of health in Yoruba and Hausa, which is lafia alafia. And the disease is the absence of alafia, is the absence of well-being. So he then goes into English and says, disease is not so much about pathogens, but it is about dis-ease. And the whole point of healthcare is to see what you can do to restore ease to a person's life. Yet we have specialized in pathogen care. My office here in Oxford is in the Peter Medawa Pathogen Center, right? So we're busy chasing pathogens and trying to block pathogens. And we've even declared war on pathogens, which is leading to antimicrobial resistance because they've also declared war back. They need to fight back. But that's the game. And we keep going that way. But can we think of life and disease more as trying to bring a person who is in a state of ill at ease back to a state of ease? But this is going to be very difficult because, and this then comes to the end of life and everything. So once in our educational system and in our cultures, what we tend to promote is an atomistic way of living. And the models of success are models grounded on us not needing other people. The more successful you are in life, the more you can control who has contact with you because the person has to come in within your terms. I just flew back from the United States, and those of us who sit in economy know this very well, right? The wealthier you are, the more you are kind of separated from other people. So it becomes, when life is, structured in a way that we are always in pursuit of that degree of autonomy and control, before certain events like death, which we no longer have a control of, we feel powerless, frustrated, and we do not even have the language to share. We don't have the tools. I've just published a book called Emergent Personhood, came out 2 weeks ago, where it was the untapped insights from Africa. And there the argument is that a person, what we call persons, is an emergent reality that emerges out of a series of relationships. Never in the history of thinking has personhood been reduced to just human beings. Christians think God is a person. Muslims think Allah is a person. In the medieval times, angels were jumping up and down as persons with names Raphael, and even in Oxford, we still use Michaelmas, Hilary, and all that. We're still appealing to those beings, right, as if they were persons. So persons go beyond the realm of humans. But what makes a person, if we consider a person as a being with a certain moral standing, which means that we cannot treat it the way we would treat a non-person, is the series of relationships. And therefore, even the English language is extremely poor in expressing this because the English language uses the word relationship. Relationship means something that exists and then relates with another. In other languages, like in Spanish, they speak about una existencia vinculada, a vinculated existence, a bonded existence. So even before I am an individual, I am already bound to other people. From my DNA to my language to my identity to the color of my skin to my gender, I'm already bonded. And therefore, my upbringing and socialization should be a socialization that ethically drives me towards ensuring that those bonds out of which I emerge as a being are healthy. And that my emergence and my flourishing does not damage the flourishing of other people. And so when it comes to even the end of life, what is actually happening there is that these bonds that are holding together my being are being dissolved. And therefore, they're being dissolved in a certain way, which means that it becomes, my dying becomes not just a me question, but a we question. And when it becomes a we question, then we actually face it. And that is where, like, I mean, talking about shared decisions and all that, it is only natural that it should be that way. But then when we do not, you know, I mean, organize our life according to that, that is where, I mean, issues like loneliness become so important. And as the Spaniards would say, that loneliness is deeper than just physical proximity. You know, there is, I think it's Spanish, this guy from Valde, I can't remember the name of the town, but he writes good songs. He says, "Es tu distancia estando cerca lo que más me duele." It is your distance being so close to me, that is what hurts me most. So you can actually be in the midst of people, yet their non-comprehension and non-participation, deep participation in your condition is what actually sometimes drives people to wanting to die. But you see, now we are in the midst of it. And I don't think our generation will change this because we have been programmed that way. My only thinking is that, you know, as this particular era in which we're living is gradually heading towards a crisis, we should begin to think about how to educate a new generation that will be grounded on different principles. These principles have been useful, but we are now exhausting this paradigm. And therefore, we should have the courage and humility, courage to think far, humility to accept that we got some things deeply wrong, and see how we can educate a new generation. Sorry, I'm talking too long, but that's enough. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for these rich talks, and I open the floor to questions. Please join.
Sorry, I hope it's not too grim what we say.
Hi there, and thank you all so much. That was fascinating to listen to. You've sort of all spoken in the context of palliative care and decisions around end-of-life care. And I suppose I'm curious, what lessons can you take from end-of-life care and the decision-making and the companionship, and transfer those into discussions around healthcare and clinical decision-making for those with long-term or chronic health conditions, which can often bring with them the same degree of sort of physical suffering and loneliness without necessarily the medical resources that the end-of-life care brings.
I would say the same. That the same way of communicating, the same way of seeing that person in their fullness. For me, sometimes there were patients who had chronic pain, chronic conditions which were intractable, and with those patients, I would actually ask them to come at the end of the surgery and have half an hour, maybe a bit more, and ask them to tell me their story. Because quite often they would just come and it would just be a sort of iteration of more drugs, more this, more referrals. Just tell me your story. And actually, that completely changed the relationship and made it very different. And their story often, there was a lot of trauma. And I can give examples so that somebody who was coming every fortnight, one of those quotes heart sink patients, would come then maybe 5 times a year at the most. So for me, that was absolutely key. It was what we call a narrative approach, listening to their story. What is it really matters to you? Often it wasn't what you thought it was. And this sort of kind of sending them off to sort of fragmented kind of care, that they would go off to one specialist, another, and then they'd be discharged. And that also included mental health, patients with mental health, because although psychiatrists, psychologists do a good job, they were people that they just couldn't cope with, and they would just send them back to us. The GPs always had to take whoever nobody else wants. So that would be my approach. It'd be the same, using, the dignity and care approach. I hope that answers the question, but Jill.
I know when I was a practice nurse and used to deal with a lot of diabetes mainly, in a 15-minute appointment, I was always running over, because actually to see the change in somebody's diabetes sugar levels, you needed to know them. You needed to know what their job was. You could give them all the 5 fruit and veg a day, but if they're working 14 hours a day in a hot kitchen, they're going to be snacking on whatever they can get their hands on. So I know that, like Caesar, that sometimes there needs to be a change in the system, right? And I know some GP surgeries are really looking at that, because they can't sustain long-term disease management. Is becoming greater and greater, obesity, mental health, diabetes. So I think, like in palliative care, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a need, and people getting together and say, look, there's this need here. How can we look at this? Because, as I said, there is GP surgeries, one particular, who are changing the way in which they do things, but they can't sustain the way long-term disease management is being looked at. So they've got social prescribers, they've got a chaplain there, they've got a GP there, they've got a paramedic there to change, and they're trying to change the system. So not really an answer, but I think if there's a need, firstly, then you run with the need, and getting people around you, because I think the system, we can't let it dictate, because we can't squeeze ourselves into these tight boxes.
Yeah, and just to add, I think that's absolutely right. Compassionate communities, social prescribing, I don't like the word, but all these actually, there's so many resources and assets in a community that can be very helpful for conditions which lead people to feel lonely and abandoned. So absolutely, you have to tailor it for the person, but there's much more emphasis now on a community approach.
Yeah, just to agree and to say that if I think of the global south, or many of the countries in Africa, where you have one GP, one doctor to 10,000 people, you can't expect someone like that to have that sort of closeness to their patients. In the UK, you're talking about 1 to every 300 or so, 1 to 200 and something. So they were talking 1 to 10,000. And this is where we need to draw on the resources of our communities. And when societies are organized in such a way that we're all running from morning to evening to be able to earn a living, we don't have time to sit down with people, because that's how we are organized. We need to run. And then when we are tired and we need to relax, we go running again. So we don't have time. But I remember, whenever I have the opportunity to return to the village, for example, the way people can just sit down, and somebody who is ill, even if they can't speak, they're lying there. But the children are screaming, people are talking. And all those things mean a lot. But the way we are organized, we can't do that here, because if you do that, you won't earn a living.
Yeah, hi there. I work as a surveyor for councils adapting properties for the elderly and disabled, and obviously your references to palliative care is not, for me, we're adapting properties for people where they want to stay at home, whether it's end of life or dementia or various other significant conditions. But I would assume that you would be encouraging people, or people who are referencing to you, the desire to remain in their home, to be around family, to be in a familiar environment with everyone present today, a lot of us in our 40s, 50s, who've either got parents who are going through this stage now. It's partly to inform people here today that all the councils around the country offer what's called a grant to adapt properties, and the benefits that I see in my role as we adapt properties, whether it's difficulties getting into the shower, getting into the property itself with ramps and platforms. Often for me, it's very emotive, my job, when it's disabled children. So there's very generous grants out there for families of disabled children. So enabling people to remain at home is essential. Whenever I visit people, they, as I say, want to remain in their properties, and for their mental well-being, it's obviously essential. So just more so for people in this room who've got parents who are going through that stage at the moment, it is about contacting your GP and your occupational therapist. And then the councils do fund very generously grants for adapting properties, so to make it a lot easier for the families.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a little comment about, I love the quote by Dr. Francis Peabody, about good physician knows their patient through and through. And I think most people's experience of their GP is not that. It's quite fragmented, not being able to see the same doctor, and there are lots of different doctors in a practice. But really my question is, I think in my experience, and I'm a doctor myself, the only aspect of medicine where I see spirituality as a given is in end-of-life palliative care. Whereas in other aspects of medicine, I don't think it's even apparent, you know, it's not sort of there. So I wonder what you think about that.
Can I go first? Yeah, you're right. I think a lot of doctors are very averse, and psychotherapists as well. And yet, why? Because having those conversations about people's religious, spiritual beliefs, it can tell one so much, and it's such a wonderful resource. So even if you don't believe yourself, to not engage, I think it does help if you have a belief of your own that you can. But they're very wary of imposing, you know, we can't bring religion into it. And you're right, it's extraordinary that there is this sort of barrier. And certainly in my work as a therapist, I work as a compassion-focused therapist, that people you bring up who is a compassionate person in your mind, and it might be Jesus, it might be the Prophet Muhammad, and it might be so, and that we make space for that. It's something that's so beneficial. So I agree, but I certainly have engaged, and there's a lot of evidence that people who have a belief can cope better with chronic disease and all these things. So yeah, I agree. Yeah.
If I can just add to that. We just published a paper in Bioethics saying religion welcome. And you can imagine the number of papers we've received attacking our paper, which is fine, I mean, it's all right. But you see, this is one of the things that I find quite, difficult to understand. We keep talking about patient-centered care. If religion is an important aspect of a patient, and you say you want to be patient-centered, and then you tell the patient that when you come to the door of my consultancy, leave your religion out, and yet you want to be patient-centered. There is something there that doesn't seem to, there's something missing. Now, once again, why do we have this strong not only secular, but anti-religious sentiment. There are historical reasons in the history of Europe that led to the French Revolution and the exaltation of secular. And even the word secular itself, you can only understand it against a religious background. Because, I mean, yeah, things of this century and not things of the future, right? That's why we talk about a secular world. But then the error too is to want to then even impose this on everybody whose culture and whose history is different. If you've had problems with your religion, don't export it to everybody else's religion. Take it easy. Right. So, but I think there is, and I don't blame the medical profession. It is just a question of the education, and maybe because I'm a teacher, I keep going back to education. Like when we are training medics, we don't give them any class, any lecture on how to deal with spirituality. And we're not asking them to believe. I mean, I personally don't practice any religion, but I'm willing to welcome people who have their religious beliefs and to engage with them if it is part of their health-seeking journey. But we need to train people to be able to do that, and they have no training for that. So you can't throw them after they finish their medical training and ask them to improvise from one day to the other.
Yeah, thank you. The last couple of questions, we've kind of extrapolated a bit from end-of-life care to general medicine and education of doctors and so on. To extrapolate a bit further, we've got 100% diagnosis rate of mortality of all of us. Is there something from your experiences kind of at the sharp end of that that you would give as advice to all of us who are afflicted with long-term mortality about how to live, how to relate now in sort of in super long-term preparation for death?
Yeah, Joe, you have a go.
How much time have we got? 2 minutes. Well, I mean, yeah, I definitely, I guess, relate that these same questions at the end of the life, why do we wait till the end of life to get to them? I guess because at the end of life, every single bit of us is brought into question. Our physical, our job, our spiritual, we're torn open, you know? So, but yeah, I guess, why wait? And I suppose, you know, some of the things that are coming out, you know, what we've kind of spoken a little bit about that come into my mind is, yeah, do we even ask the questions? Are we so busy? Excuse me, sorry, thanks. You know, are we so busy to even be struck about what our need is or what we're suffering with or what we're struggling with, you know? Because if we're so busy, you know, taken and distracted, those kind of questions never really might come to the forefront. But I guess it's that what helps us to really be able to look at ourselves, what helps us not to reduce any aspects of ourselves, you know, and for some of us, health and sickness is given to us to help us. In other ways, it doesn't need health and sickness to make us expose ourselves. Yeah, I'm conscious to get.
Yeah. Do you want to go?
No, well, if I suppose this one thing is to, it's more philosophical, but you know, death is a process which we verify at the end of it. So we are all in it, in the process anyway. It will be verified when it's complete, but it started. And there is no worry. I mean, that's just it. Secondly, one thing that I find missing and which we could all be doing more, and it doesn't necessarily have to be gloomy, is, you know, a bit of reflection. You know, like have moments where you kind of think, I mean, and even just be grateful. I mean, I'm over 50 years old. Many people didn't get here. And they're perhaps better than me. They would have done better to this universe than I am, than I'm doing. And I'm not going to be here forever. But to live with that consciousness, I think it's not tragic. It's actually a beautiful thing, because if you can even build feelings of gratitude, because at the end of the day, the fact that I'm still here and I'm breathing and I'm talking to you guys today, I owe it to many people.
Yeah.
And that builds a sense of gratitude and a sense of wanting to give meaning to other people's lives as well. But, we're a very noisy culture. And we fear silence, we fear thinking. We are not happy to be with ourselves. Even though we want autonomy, we can't stand ourselves. Right? And so building that habit of actually just thinking about my own existence and learning to be happy and grateful for it, I think is one way to prepare, knowing that this is a finite existence. It will end. And even if it ends tomorrow, hey, man, it's been good. Thanks.
Yeah. I think gratitude is absolutely key. And you can tell I like books, but there's one by Oliver Burkeman called 4,000 Weeks. And he's written another one called Meditations for Mortals. And it's basically about accepting your finitude and really kind of relishing it and experience what you say, the gratitude, and not sort of not thinking, oh, tomorrow or when I retire, oh, I'll be able. It's just do it now. What is it that really matters to you? Just do it now. I mean, it's sort of his thing is a 4-week thing. You read a chapter every day, and it's good.
Thank you very much for sharing. It was really beautiful. I just apologize for my English. I'm just a bit nervous. I wanted to ask if, in your experience, you do see like a correlation between like treatment and medicines and accompanying someone, because it's not about dying, because it is personal that I'm alive. And but I did experience, like, I was in a hospital for like condition that the doctors couldn't at first really figure out what it was. I was given medicines because I wasn't really doing well, and I wasn't responding to the medicines. The doctors didn't really know what to do. It was COVID. Nobody was allowed in the hospital. But the doctors from my ward decided to let my mom in, despite it was officially against the rules. When my mom started coming in, I started responding to the medicines. And like my mom, like most of the days towards like the end of my time in hospital, she was there for 12 hours out of 24. So quite a lot. But yeah, literally the same medicines I was responding to. When my mom started coming and I wasn't feeling alone, I started like responding to. So I wanted to ask, like in accompanying someone, whether it's dying or something else, whether it does make a difference in your experience. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you are probably a witness to us, you know. And I think, I think definitely it shows that we're not just you just showed us, we're not just our biology, right, or the biochemistry. And I definitely would see patients, you know, kind of with vomiting. And then this gentleman, you know, he would then he started to go out and have a cigarette with someone in the gardens, and he got to know them a bit. And as the time went on, the amount of anti-sickness tablets that we were given totally reduced. Unfortunately, the person who went out having a cigarette with died, and then again, the symptoms, roller coasted back. So for sure, we are one body, but we have all of these different parts which have such an effect. That's only just one small example, but for sure we are.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And you know about the placebo effect. I mean, that can be enormous, 40%. I mean, if it was a medicine, that would be pretty good. So, of course, yeah, these relationships, that feeling that you're with somebody who cares about you and makes a difference. And there was a very interesting study of babies on a special care unit, that when the mother was there close to the baby, the oxygen levels would go up. So, just literally the presence. So, yeah, I'm sure that played a part. Thank you.
And just to add that, especially in the area of mental health, this has proven to be quite important. I mean, we see in many parts, at least in West Africa anyway, people will take their psychiatric medicines, but if they take the medicines and then maybe they go to some prayer group or something, they respond better. Because I suppose, I mean, all these things predispose the person in a way that I suppose the body responds. Maybe there's no serious, I'm not in a position to give a logical, explanation, but there is evidence that these things do matter.
Hi, I'm coming probably from the other spectrum of the continuum because I'm a midwife. And,
great.
Yeah, and I was thinking while listening to you that actually a lot of things that resonated with when you were speaking about how we approach the end of life. I think that is so linked on how we are approaching now the beginning of life.
Yes.
And how we are welcoming, and all the things that you were saying about reducing life to a biological thing. That could be said about birth.
Yeah.
Can be said about, like that. And I think and it's interesting that to me, that they are so in the continuum, I think, but it makes sense that we are facing death like that, because we are facing the beginning of life like that. And we think that the more, and it's not about not being technological, but the more we detach that for being a human matter, all the things that you were saying is that because that is a human matter. It's not about a series of other things, and to me it was about that. And I don't know whether you experienced that in your field, but I think there's sometimes a way of distracting from bringing back that gaze of the totality of life as a human matter, first and foremost, is a way that everything that is additional to the biological way of seeing things is reduced to is your interpretation, is your ideology. That can be a matter of belief. So making that as a battle of different beliefs rather than actually as going back to the focus that no, it's not the you can't believe there is not biological or not. It's about helping each other to see that as part of that. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, birth is in saying a child being born is miraculous in a way. And again, there's that sense of wonder, which it can be so completely eclipsed. So now I resonate with that. I mean, I used to do quite a lot of antenatal care as a GP and loved it, and even did deliveries in the hospital. So yeah, I agree. That's become very medicalized and protocolized, and it's lost. I think that's partly why people now have doulas. They have doulas at birth, and they now have doulas at death because they feel they need somebody who's closer to, closer to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book by Philippe Ariès on the history of death in the West.
Yeah.
Just talks about how we tend to. We gain maybe technically by relegating a lot of these things to professionals and distancing them from ourselves, right? But what it also reveals is that something in us gets poorer when we are not exposed to these experiences. And like Paquita was saying, to see and experience a birth, even not as a professional, but just as a human being, and to assist at a death, they mark you. And sometimes I think one of the reasons why we get into pointless arguments and we can hold on to positions about things that, we're even willing to destroy our neighbors because of stupid things, is because we've forgotten about birth and death. So we latch on to things that are not important, and re-exposing us to this, that there is a beginning point, and you come out and you're just so, the greatest parasite we have is the human baby. Like, you have to basically you take from others, and you're going to end too. And so why bother sometimes just grabbing onto things and getting into, like very radical conflicts about irrelevancies? So I think these are things that culturally, even just introducing our younger people to these experiences will help just broaden their horizons.
Thank you for bringing that. It's lovely.
Thank you so much again for your talk. And I truly believe everyone can bring home something. And thanks again.
Thank you.